So, good evening everyone. Gumba Malgan, Gumba Nani Gianindu, Yoragari State Library of Queensland Gu, which is good evening, it's good to see you, and welcome friends to the State Library of Queensland. And it certainly is fantastic to see all of you tonight on a cold, rainy night in Queensland in October, so thank you for coming along. My name is Vicky McDonald and I'm the State Librarian and CEO here at the State Library, and on behalf of my colleagues I welcome you this evening to Portrait of an Artist, Gordon Shepherdson retrospective. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. State Library is located on Kirilpa Point, which is a traditional meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we'll continue that tradition this evening, but also every day of the year here at the State Library. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge Nathan Shepherdson, award-winning poet and Gordon's son, Helen Brodie, President of the Queensland Library Foundation, Louise Martin-Chew, arts writer extraordinaire, who has lent her skills to many digital interviews for the James C Sourris AM collection, and we certainly welcome you back this evening, Louise. Bruce Heiser, gallerist and valuer and director of Bruce Heiser Projects, so welcome Bruce. And certainly, ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to see so many of you here this evening and so many people who've been supporting us for many years. So tonight is the third presentation of our 2019 Portrait of an Artist series. And the Portrait of an Artist series was conceived in 2016 as a means to bring to life the James C Sourris AM collection of artist interviews, which is part of the Australian Library of Art here at the State Library of Queensland. And these interviews tell the stories of some of our country's finest and most respected contemporary artists and reveal a great breadth and diversity of practice and experience. And you would have seen the long list of names on this slide before, so many names that are so well recognised within Australia. Filmed in their studios and workrooms, the interviews allow the artists to share personal reflections on the influences that have shaped their lives and their work. And the artist interviews provide a valuable resource for current and future generations. And we are immensely grateful for the immense generosity of our donors, the James C Sourris AM and his sister Marika Sourris, who support us in delivering this important work. Tonight, we will have the pleasure of hearing about the life and work of the late Gordon Shepherdson. And Gordon was born in Brisbane in 1934 and studied art under the tutorage of Caroline Barker, John Mulvig and Andrew Sibley, while working days in the city's shipyards and abattoirs. He is widely known and celebrated as one of Australia's most important figurative expressionist painters and is represented in the National Gallery of Australia as well as many state, regional and university galleries. With an exhibiting history of over 50 years, Gordon Shepherdson was a recipient of the Tattersalls Club Landscape Prize, the Georges Art Prize and a 3-time finalist in the Archibald Prize. Working from his studio, a small shed at the bottom of his backyard, Gordon recorded, primarily for his own satisfaction, one man's stay on the planet, the uneasy balance between man and his environment. His artworks are rich in emotional response to place, displaying a brooding, deeply personal romanticism using a handful of recurring motifs. Queensland Art Gallery honoured Gordon's legacy by displaying 2 of his works in the atrium of the gallery. Gordon often elected to use his hands to paint, reserving brushes only for the black enamel paints he loved. Over the decades, his work became increasingly reductionist, using negative space to compress the imagery and intensify its sensory experience. His legacy speaks of a humble man, deeply aware of human vulnerability, with a passion for spending extended periods of time quietly and patiently observing nature. So it's a pleasure to welcome here tonight our panellists, Louise Martin-Chew, Bruce Heiser and Gordon's son Nathan Shepherdson, to share their memories of this remarkable man. Louise, as you would know, is a freelance arts writer who has contributed to magazines, newspapers and catalogues for over 30 years, and she will shortly join well-known gallerist and valuer Bruce Heiser, as well as Nathan, an award-winning poet in his own right, in conversation. If you're actually joining the conversation on social media tonight, remember to use the hashtag SLQPortrait so that others can hear about what we're enjoying this evening. But for now, please enjoy the screening and then it'll be followed by tonight's Q&A. Thank you.
So Gordon, you often talk about your painting as a kind of a record of your stay on the planet.
Yeah, that's right.
Pretty long stay now.
Yeah,
You've been doing it for
right.
what, 40 years? 50
Yeah.
years?
Yeah, it would be that, yeah.
At least
About 50. That's all it is, just an old man recording his stay on the planet. Nothing more, nothing less.
So you paint for yourself?
You got it, hands up.
Yeah, yeah. So people can either take it or leave it?
Audience of one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The local bush turkey.
You're right, Ace?
Yeah. How long's your turkey been building this?
They bred in that last year and they're breeding again now.
It's interesting the way you store your works in that big box down there. Once works are completed, that's where they go, or they go to an exhibition. Your shows usually do pretty well.
Yeah, which surprises me. I'll tell you.
Why does it surprise you?
It just does.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I've got to say, sometimes it surprises me too. Because your work it's a fairly unique kind of practice. So you've got a lot of people that still collect your work, and
I don't know how
it
all works.
They clearly speak to somebody else as well, though.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Brisbane, or your childhood was spent here in Brisbane?
I'm born and bred
In
right
Brisbane.
here.
Did you draw as a child?
Nah, no more than anybody else.
When was it you think you really decided that you wanted to kind of paint?
I was late going,
Late starter.
Yeah, but also too, I don't talk to that side of my family much at all. They all run and claim you now. All the later ones are underneath.
The most recent ones? What's really interesting when you go through the box is the way that a lot of motifs kind of come back after a period of time. So you'll do, like those landscapes that you've been working on, and then you're working on those winged figures, and then occasionally the bull image comes back. It's interesting the way those things come back in cycles.
It's just me.
Yeah.
It's just my life, I suppose.
Yeah. So the bull image goes back to your time when you were working on
it goes.
what we now call meat processing plants.
On the floor.
The abattoir?
Yeah, that's right.
So you used to actually hump the carcasses? And
Yeah, well, I was 16 years as a meat lumper, and of course the bullocks all knew. They knew what was coming.
And you were aware of the fact that these beasts were aware of their death? But,
Very much so.
Yeah.
They knew all about it.
It's a very strong motive.
Well, you could really spend the rest of your life painting them.
Well, you could,
Yeah, no trouble.
Yeah. I mean, painters sometimes say that they just spend their whole life painting the one painting, just trying to get it better.
Yeah. Yeah.
This one?
No. Some of them like that.
Yeah.
They're very seductive, those beaches.
They are.
And I thought,
Something
give
about
up.
The sand and water.
Painting them because they were becoming very addictive.
Yeah.
Well, there's another 7 down below those.
Yeah, they're nice, those little landscapes.
They're all recent ones.
Yeah, these ones,
I've seen. The winged images have got to go back up in the wall and get plastered.
Are you going to rework them?
I'll work on them.
You will rework them rather than
rework them and see what happens. Yeah.
It's very much about the process, about using the paint and letting it tell you in a way.
As I say, just put it up and make a mark, whatever you're doing. The mark will tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you really don't work with any preconception, do you?
No,
you kind of just go with...
No, not at all. The only preconception is I've got to put some paint in.
Yeah.
I start off, and if it's going well, it goes well. But I don't consciously say, let's try to get into it now.
No.
It's a process.
They evolve, And that decision about when things are working or not working.
Yeah.
It's a hard one to pin down, but you kind of know.
Oh, you
know when you're on a run, or
you've just been looking at those bloody winged images.
That's right. Yeah. And so when something doesn't work, you're quite prepared to go back and continue to work with it. You don't abandon things or destroy things.
Sometimes I'd scrub them.
Yeah,
and just paint something else.
Yes.
But those particular winged images, I want to try and work them
Yeah.
You know the history of the winged image and me.
Well, sort of, but tell me.
Yeah. Well, it's a water planet, okay? And since there's been people on the planet, how many of them have perished in the water?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
How many of them have been pulled out? A percentage. I reckon they pulled out 25%, and the other 75%, their souls are still there. So that's what that picture as you walk in, that's what, see dark eyes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it's about. And it goes on from there.
Yeah. And you still work on paper? Rather than canvas or board, it's your material of choice?
Yeah, the French Disson paper. And I find it real good. The immediacy of it, I suppose.
But it's also the way you work, because you use your fingers a lot. And,
that's right. Yeah.
So I guess that's not going to work with a canvas where you've got no resistance to it. You've got a good solid surface to work on. Yeah.
Somebody gave me a canvas once, and I burnt that in a palette knife just by the steps.
And brushes, you gave up brushes long ago?
Occasionally I use them, but only on the black enamel, but all just a hand.
Yeah.
I'm pleased I've got a hand.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Your work consists a lot of night landscapes, which is kind of interesting. It's not something that many painters tackle. It's a pretty rare subject when you start to look around.
I can't tell you why, but it's a beautiful subject.
It is a beautiful subject.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from going out in the dark, early morning fishing, doesn't it?
I'd say.
Yeah.
Sitting out there under...
waiting for a bite.
Under Kate Morton.
Yeah. You read a bit? You're a bit of a fan of old Sam Beckett?
Yeah. Most of the Beckett plays and stuff are here. I could have had a chat to Beckett.
You could have done it. I'm sure you would have got on very well with that Sam Beckett. But his ideas about space and silence, being prepared to be silent.
Yeah.
I wonder sometimes if there's not a relationship between that silence and that darkness in your paintings, so that the darkness becomes like a container almost for what's in there.
Yeah, well, it's just the way I've always painted. Always, enjoyed the darks very much. Very much. That's what's wrong with those bloody winged images.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You think so?
Oh, I know so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too much light.
You got it. Yeah.
Thanks all for being with us tonight. So lovely to see that footage, and you really get a sense of the endearing character that Gordon was. Lovely to be here with Nathan Shepherdson and Bruce Heiser.
Thank you.
I think that was a masterful interview by David Burnett. I don't know if he's here tonight, but Gordon was not renowned for being particularly voluble about his work, and I think David drew him out in a way that was almost unprecedented in that particular 8 minutes. But any of you who have seen the entire video could see that it wasn't always easy. So Nathan, I might start with you. What was it like to live with Gordon when you were growing up? Did he talk about his work at home to you all?
Not a lot, really. It was an interesting, it was great to be in that house, and you could just really feel the ideas that were floating around, I think, and he was super minimal in what he'd say, really. So it is. So I think I was saying to you earlier, it's great that video exists, because he hated having his photograph taken, and he hated talking about his work, and about himself, really, except for the odd fishing story. He was happy enough with the fishing story. But, and I could tell he was a bit nervous there, because he gets a bit of an extra twang. But good on him for doing it, really. And David's a long-term interpreter of his work, so it was nice, as relaxed as it could have been in that circumstance, I think.
Yeah.
And but yeah, as far as being at home, like he'd usually just say, like if he had a win in his idea of things, he'd say, "Oh, something you might like down the shed." So I'd sort of just wander down and yeah. But having said that, he would want me to say what I thought about it and everything. So it was just ongoing dialogue, which was great, really. So obviously, when I was at home, you know, it just seemed like normal territory. And then when I was a bit older, like as I would visit, yeah, like I was really excited to see what he'd been up to, really. And he was amazing. Like before he became unwell, he was really painting 5 nights out of 7. I think he'd really just, he'd just keep going, really.
Driven to it.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, when you said he was looking for a bit of feedback from you, did he have the similar kind of relationship with your brother and with your mother Nola before she passed away?
Yeah, well, my brother had been he's lived in North Queensland for about 30 years, so he wasn't there as much. But a kind of different relationship in a way, because my brother is he's the acknowledged heir of the fishing capabilities of Gordon. and I'm not, unfortunately. But so they're like Luke loves Gordon and loves his work and everything, but the conversation for them would be usually more about fishing. And but Luke's intensely proud of what he's done,
yes.
Obviously. So yeah, so I guess we were talking just earlier. David touches on that, the Beckett thing, and the idea of conversation almost moving towards silence. So how you can sort of break down complexity into its simpler parts, and yet what you're left with is a sort of greater complexity almost, I suppose, how diamonds are formed or something, really. It's that the pressure you put on an idea until it becomes a sort of semi-precious gemstone or something. It's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, the conversations we had and didn't have were great.
Yes, yeah. What about you, Bruce? How did you first meet Gordon?
Well, I met Gordon really through Nathan, but I did ring him one time. Nathan reminded me when we were speaking earlier, because I'm a bit of a Mulvig obsessive. It's quite tragic. And I rang Gordon out of the blue one night to see if I could come over and talk to him about Mulvig, because I knew they'd been so close, such very good friends, but probably primarily through Nate. That was in the sort of mid to late 80s.
And then you worked with Philip Bacon when Gordon was showing there a bit later than that? Yeah.
And prior to that, I'd helped Gordy with 1 or 2 exhibitions where we would make the frames, so the work on the easel, for instance, the frames were made by a carpenter friend of Gordon's, and then Gordon would, insert the pictures, do all the mount boards, etc. So I worked on 1 or maybe 2 of those, and then I worked on maybe 3 shows or so, maybe when I was with Philip. So that was great. That was a wonderful experience. It was an amazing experience, because he'd walk into the shed, and it just has this aroma. And like Nate said, he'd say, I'd go over and visit Nate at night and go and say, there might be something down the shed you might enjoy. And so, we'd go down. It was like Christmas. It was like Christmas morning. It was like Yontif. It was like you'd go down, and Nathan would have the key, and the key had this little metallic key ring that Gordy had painted, remember? It had anyway, and we'd open up the door, and it was amazing.
And the footage of the shed that you've seen in the film is incredible, because it didn't change over decades. It was a tiny little garden shed, the most unpretentious artist studio possible. Yeah,
it was interesting, almost like a type of intellectual pantomime or something, because where the door is next to the wall that he painted on mostly, so you'd sort of have this sort of you get in the shed and you can look around the corner and see what's there. It's a great wall. I'm still going down there now, and I just look at the wall, really. It's just fantastic, because he's got just thousands of fingerprints all over it, and
you tape up the pieces of paper and paint to be going off the edge.
It's just a masonite wall, but the bottom 2 feet is just sort of curved like this because of so much linseed oil. The linseed oil's just soaked into it so much it's just sort of curved, and as you saw the palette in the film, it's just a remarkable thing in itself.
And the series of hats that were, I don't know if they were ever new, but they just
some
seemed to
stage.
have a patina of age.
Yeah. Yeah, Mum would probably about every 15 years she'd say, I think you need a new hat, Gordon. So. But then hat shops sort of disappeared for a while, so it wasn't always easy to get them. Yeah, so anyway.
So Bruce, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about this painting.
Mm-hmm. So that I think that dates from maybe sort of mid to late 90s. It's one of his winged figures that Gordon was talking about in the film. It's a remarkable painting because it's quite a small picture, but that blue is just so intense. Nate was saying earlier, it's quite light for Gordy, and it is, but there's always a few telltale signs in his pictures. So if you can see, I don't know how well you can see that painting, but if you see there's a red ribbon of paint, can you see that? Can I get up? Sorry. So if you see that sort of ribbon of paint along there, so that usually, if that's there, then that usually indicates there's a bullock image in the work, because as Gordon was saying, the bullock is such an important motif in his work. It was a really incredible seminal time in his life, seeing those beasts, slaughtered. And so with the figure of the breast, the top half of the figure actually becomes the bullock's head. So that circle there is where the beasts were slaughtered with the stump, and then the breasts of the figure become the eyes, and then tapering down into the hips to the nostrils, and then the wings of the figure actually become the horns as well. So once you so and that blue ribbon also used to indicate the mane on the back of the bullock as well. So if you see those sorts of things, then you know there's a bullock somewhere in there. But often they're quite complex images, and there's probably maybe a couple of bullocks in that, and then you've got the face of the woman. But it was really interesting to hear him talking about the winged images, because it's always been a bit of a mystery to me. And he, like Mulvig, he was very reticent in talking about his work. He really did paint for an audience of one. That was one of his very, famous quotes. And he didn't mean it in a glib way. He was just saying, it's just for me, and if other people enjoy it, then that's fantastic.
Yeah, the winged images are strange. I don't really know where they came from either. But I guess there's one example, like he did this sort of youth... He did have a flight series, I think would have been, I don't know, late 80s or something. And it was a really interesting painting of this youth that had wing on it. I thought, And I did say to him, I didn't normally say this to him, but I said, where'd that come from, And he said, I was walking the dog this morning, Fido. And he said, I saw a lily growing out of a pile of lawn clippings or something, and I thought, well, how'd you end up with that? But I didn't actually ask him, so I just sort of, that was the way he just said, oh yeah, okay. And but yeah, interestingly, the winged figures are often, I guess, that there's a lot of, sort of overwrought art with winged images and things, but his often don't have arms, so just the wings. And I think he even did one where it might have been just an arm and a wing. So they're not really designed to fly. So I think that's part of the idea behind those, is they may have the wings, but they won't be able to take off. So it's interesting,
His work was so, when you look at this painting here and all of the ones on the screen behind you, there's such emotion and expressivity in the work. No matter the subject, he did a lot of the sort of moonscapes and works about being out fishing in the dark. There's always the dark, and there's the silences, and then there's the sea of eyes and the winged figures, and then the portraits. He obviously had an amazing ability to turn his sort of thoughts and reading and interests into these really unforgettable images.
Yeah, I think, there's different strands really. I think the portraits are another whole topic for conversation almost, but he would read, he was a great reader of people. I think in the early days, like he would just, it sounds weird, but he'd sort of hang out at a bus stop or something and just say to someone, how about I paint your portrait? bring your, because he's a very shy guy, so that's a big thing for him really. Bring your boyfriend, I'll give you a feed of fish, whatever, And that's how it happened.
Wow.
But these days, I guess you get arrested. But as it became, the portraits became more complex. Like it was normally people he'd be in conversation with, and he'd just drop it on them straight away. Let's do a portrait, and they'd say like, "Oh yeah, when? Like now?" And they'd just disappear really. And so often he'd often do two portraits. Like it was interesting because he'd do one with them there, with the person there, and one without them there. So whether that was, I'm not really sure, but it was probably, I don't know. So often the second one would be even more progressive, maybe. So maybe it was, I don't know. He felt he was damaging them or something while they were there or something. There's been some great stories about people. Some people loved them. Some people just really couldn't handle them at all. Like there was one guy came out one day after he'd painted his portrait. He was really excited about the portrait, but when he saw it, he literally ran away. He ran out up the side of the house and yelled out to Mum, "He's got a piece of me in that shed." People have different reactions, but I find it a fascinating process, and sort of in a way sadly, but like it was such a secretive process for him. I only really got to see him paint when he did my portrait a couple of times, and then just right near just before he stopped painting, I'd sort of help him out a couple of times, just squeezing out paint and things like that. But so I really didn't get to see him paint as a process. So it was I guess for the sitter, that's a privileged space to be in, really. So
he was obviously a very sensitive man, yet he worked, for 23 years at the abattoir, and as you see in the film, he perceived the bullocks' fear, and he said they could tell what was about to happen, and he would obviously be very involved in delivering that blow. Do you think it affected him?
I don't think it's possible to be involved in that sort of situation and not be affected. He was an incredibly intuitive, empathetic sort of individual and really understood the natural world, the world around him. And so I think he was incredibly sensitive and empathetic. And I think so. But I think also that generation were quite stoic. And so it's just, that's the world, that is life. But I think it would have to have had an impact, because there was a chap who worked in the abattoirs who, he had the job, I won't go into details, but he actually assisted in killing the beasts, and he would have to wear a raincoat because of the amount of body fluids. So, if you see that day in, day out, then that's going to have an impact. I would have thought. Yeah. But it wasn't like a, post-traumatic stress. There was nothing like that at all. But I think he really understood the beasts and was really intuitive and was very respectful of them. Yeah,
it was interesting to watch those relationships, because obviously while he was still working at the abattoir and exhibiting paintings, like I think he gave up finally in about 1977, 78, something like that, where he could just sort of live off his work. But there was this, before that, it was interesting because he had a lot of respect for those people because of what they did and the way they could, I guess, just the way they went about their daily lives. And I think, but the people that did that job too, they had a lot of respect for the animals in an ironical sense, I suppose, because, at a certain point, one of the reasons he left the abattoir was at a certain point, when they started to export meat overseas. It's not really an art conversation, but anyway, they changed the way they built the abattoirs ran and everything. So it was very interesting in the way that he would look at the animals, but also look at the people that were dealing with the animals, and also, I think it definitely was a landmark thing for him, in some sort of philosophical sense, because before that he was really just, he's doing nice still lives and things like that with a palette knife, and that's true. He literally, I don't know, he must have been, I guess, in an early lesson started using a palette knife because everybody did it in the early 60s, and then he said, I just decided to set it on fire. I just didn't want to use a palette knife anymore, And it makes sense because his brushwork's just fantastic, and later with his hands. So, just have him sitting there with a palette knife sort of seems weird. But, and I think once he locked on to that subject, then he was really away at that point, and didn't look back really, I don't think.
And the abattoir pictures were not really a known subject for art either. I remember reading some of the reviews from the Johnston Gallery where they were first shown, I think. And, you wonder, the reception was obviously a bit shocked, but clearly they must have made some success for him.
And they were very dark pictures too, like tonally, they're very dark. So they would have been very difficult pictures, especially for, Johnston Gallery clients who had been going to see, Blackman, who, everybody adored, whose works were quite celebratory, to suddenly be confronted in 1964 by these very dark, sombre paintings, but are yet quite poetic and very delicate. But it would have been tough. Yeah, it would have been really tough, I think.
Yeah, he was using really big brushes too, like he was using house brushes and stuff, like 4-inch and 2-inch brushes, so really big gestural. And he did a few drawings which hardly any have survived really, but he would sort of use the side of the charcoal, so he'd sort of just draw like that. So again, it was sort of almost cutting out the bullock from the paper in a way with the charcoal, so the animal's really inside the lines. So it's again fascinating to watch.
And at what point did he change media from the masonite boards onto moving into paper?
Probably around the same time, but I guess a lot of things were happening. So he left work, he started painting on paper. He really came up with that image too, the overlay of the female figure in the bullock's head around that same time too. So probably around 1977. And I think he did James Mollison's portrait at the time, which was on masonite. And I think James might have said to him, oh, well, maybe have you thought about paper, because I don't think James was a fan of masonite, basically, and its conservative qualities. But in a way that was probably liberating for Gordon, because the practical idea of painting a masonite, like I quite liked the ones of masonite in a way, but you had to paint the painting, then you had to frame the painting and put it on the rack, but with paper, again, it just allowed this physical acceleration in the way he could work, as fast as he could think, as fast as he could work at that point. So he could really, again, it was sort of a take-off point for him. So it all happened in the late 70s, really, along with glowy body shirts and flares and all that sort of stuff. So it was all happening.
And he took some lessons with Molvig, who's the subject of the really beautiful exhibition next door at the Queensland Art Gallery. And so, Bruce, how do you think that relationship worked? In some ways, I think I can see the influence, but it's a flash here and there.
Yeah, it is. Look, I tried to broach the subject with Gordon, with Molvig, a couple of times, and I didn't really get a lot, but we spoke a little. One thing he would say about John Molvig was he was fierce, and he didn't mean that in a physical way, but just as in, I think he's quite a passionate man, and Gordon didn't say this, but I don't think he suffered fools gladly, but he was a decent person as well. That's what Gordon meant by that. He was a solid sort of person. But in terms of Gordon's work, I think I think like a lot of the younger artists at that time of the 60s, there was a debt to Mulvig, but I think Gordon's the motifs he's pursuing were quite singular in a sense. So yeah, there are maybe flashes here and there of Mulvig, but I think maybe somebody like John Ayland and Sibley had a greater debt to Mulvig than Gordon. I think Gordon was always his own person. Not that John Ayland and Sibley weren't, but like you see some of the paintings that those two men painted, and you compare them to Mulvig, and it's like, and they were like, John Ayland was a very good friend of mine, and I knew Sibley a little, but you think, whereas Gordon's work, Gordon is Gordon. You know, those bullet pictures
true.
were pretty amazing. They're quite out there, you know, considering people going to see Donald Friend exhibitions that are quite, you know, lyrical in a way, or Lesbia Thorpe, people like that, and then suddenly along comes these bullocks that are, you know, hanging up and with their tongues lolling and their eyes wide in shock and disbelief. But there is, like I said, there is a sensitivity to them as well.
And
so I don't see a lot. Like I see Mulvig, but I see Mulvig in the background as being informing the works, not slavishly copying, or I don't see the hand or the ideas of Mulvig. Yeah.
They shared some subject matter, though, I guess, particularly, I mean, I suppose most painters of that era would have done landscapes and portraits, but there were depictions of women, quite very differently expressed, but, you know, Gordon's images of women do have a ferocity at some level. What was that about?
That's a good question. I mean, I just thinking while Bruce is talking about Mulvig. I mean, one little story that clicked in mind there was he did do a couple of portraits of Mulvig, and in Dad's terminology said, you know, I had this thing, and then I you know I blew it or something, or stuffed it up or something, but. And he said, Mulvig said to him when he walked out of the shed, he said, "Man, you got to learn when to stop." So, and I think that was an important lesson. So I don't know if there's definitely an influence, but maybe it was more philosophical in a way. But I see where you're going with the imagery as well. I'm not sure. I mean, I think. I guess. No, I don't know. It's a good question, really. It's in a voluminous sense, I guess that it's, you know, you can look at the ideas just based on form and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know, because he did do male figures, but not as often. I reckon probably 1 in 10, maybe. So I'm not really sure. Do you got any ideas there, Bruce?
Well, when you first mentioned the female figure, I automatically defaulted to the housewife pictures, which occurred before the Bullock works, and there's a sort of a sombre sort of sadness about those people.
They were curious because he had these bars painted on like instead of dresses almost. So, and there was a peculiar thing at that time too. Ladies had coloured rollers in their hair, so he'd often record they'd be swimming at Wellington Point or something with their rollers in their hair. So he'd have flowers, and then he'd have these sort of coloured dots, which were actually rollers in their hair and stuff like that. So, but he'd use them in quite abstract ways. Like later on, he'd use the red bar on a shopping trolley or something. But unless I probably told you that, you wouldn't know that's what it is. So, you know.
I think also, like a lot of artists, you know, Gordon was a real observer of life, and like Nate said, you know, he would be out and about and just looking at people, and something would happen in everyday life that he saw a person bending over or a woman clutching at a bag, and that night in the shed he would record that. So he would sometimes allow images to sort of mull over in his mind as well. He really was a great thinker, a deep thinker. But there were certain things that just sort of tweaked with him for whatever reason. But they were usually everyday sort of events that may the figure may be painted nude, male and female, but it was an event that happened.
Yeah, I mean, it is something you could really explore because I think he was looking, there was a sense that someone might be a bit lost or they'd be dreaming or... so I guess they became a type in a way. And I guess in pragmatic sense, like being a guy that worked early, came home, did the shopping. He did all the shopping and a lot of the cooking. Mum did the puddings. And so I guess he was at supermarkets probably looking at people, which mostly were women, basically. So, but I don't necessarily see, maybe occasionally, but I would say, yeah, I don't necessarily see any overtly aggressive imagery. Although what I would say is that the marks, like they have these, often there'll be red marks and stuff on them. And I don't think they were literal wounds or anything, but he did say to me once that they're sort of the marks you accumulate during your life. So, yeah, so obviously didn't go a lot of way, but so yeah, I guess that's, yeah.
His work in some ways it's like writing, it's a distillation of his experience that he adds so much of himself to. And, it's interesting that you're a poet and perhaps poetry is an ideal way to respond to his work in some ways.
Yeah, he was a really good reader of poetry. And I guess Beckett, it was obviously one of his favourites, was, and Lorca was the other one. So they were both, I suppose Beckett covered all bases, but there was a lot of, so he liked reading plays and poetry. And then so he probably introduced me to things, like I got into Beckett and Lorca through him, and then I guess through what he liked, I thought, well, Dad would probably like this. And then there's a lady, a good friend of his, Pam Bell at the time, I think she got him a book on Akhmatova, the Russian poet. He loved her. And then later he fell in love with the sort of Polish poets from the 70s and 80s. And, so he was really well read in that sense. And when I was a teenager, probably at grade 9 or 10, like he was still working, and he'd come home and he'd say, he'd wander off up the hallway with this Beckett book and say, I'm just going to read a bit of Beckett, like he'd just wander off and read a bit of Beckett, have a nap, and then get up and paint. So they were a real touchstone artists for him, I think. So, and it's complicated language when you look at it, but he obviously got something out of it, And I think it's kind of I guess there is a sort of a desolation in some of that work, in a literary sense, but I guess as a counterbalance, he had his family and he had his fishing and he had, he would say that the birds would fly around the boat. I think they got to know him as a fisherman after a while, and he'd throw the frames off the boat, and so the eagles would hang around. So it was really like he was. I guess you'd say he was quite dark in a lot of ways with what he produced, but he to just talk to him is like quite a lovely guy. Mm-hmm. And the common thing, even I realised early going to shows, and that even as 10 or 12-year-old people would say, I'd hear this all the time, oh yeah, I really loved that painting, but I couldn't live with it, so, and you'd often hear that. Probably the dealers, that was probably what they didn't want to hear. but
tough, yeah. And so as a man who spent a lot of time on his own, solitary pursuits, the fishing, the painting, the reading, how did he cope when he had to go into the world, Bruce, and open an exhibition?
Reluctantly, I think the best way to describe that. He preferred the dealers to do the business side of things. He liked to keep himself at a distance from the everyday world and the art world as well. But he was good. He would visit the exhibitions quite often, and at the last day of every exhibition, he would come in with some one or two beers and just spend time with the pictures before they went to their new home. So he was reluctant to be involved in a sense in the art world. He much preferred the shed and to be at home with the family. He was quite shy. He was a very gentle sort of person. Yeah, that would,
you literally take his esky and, you know.
Yeah, a small. I didn't know whether I could go into details, but yeah.
And, but because he knew he wasn't going to see some of those paintings again, so I think that made him quite sad. You know.
He was farewelling them.
Yeah, that's right.
Really, he was.
Yeah, he's really attached to them, you know. So I guess if he had been an independently wealthy human being, he probably wouldn't have even had shows. I don't know.
No, yeah. He would have kept painting. He had
like
to.
John
paint.
Passmore or something.
He's one of those artists who had to paint. He had to paint.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he would have kept painting, but he wouldn't have sold them.
I mean, just talking to you before, like you were talking about the sort of enigma of him and his work, and that's true. I just thought of it then. He had a show at was it Solander in Solander Gallery in '84
Canberra?
In Canberra, and this guy, they were really dark pictures, and they were really hard to see things in them, you know. So people would sort of squint at them, and this guy said to him, Gordon, he stood to Gordon in front of the picture and said, I want you to tell me what this picture's about, you know. He said, listen, pal, you don't get any medals for liking them. If you like them, great. If you don't, move on. And he just walked away. You know.
Straight.
Yeah. So you know, it didn't really carry praise or anything like that.
No. He was very...
And it was probably a good response, really. Like it's kind of a silly question. But
I'll out myself. I once made the great mistake of writing... I've forgotten why I wrote to Gordon. For some reason, I've forgotten. Yeah. And I addressed the envelope, you know, Mr. Gordon Shepherdson, painter, you know, blah, 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 the address. It didn't go down well at all. It was not well received. I don't know why, but anyway, yeah. So he was very reluctant.
He didn't want to be identified as a...
I'm not exactly sure. Do you know?
I think well, we were talking a little bit earlier. I think it's a generational thing, maybe a Brisbane thing. I don't know, but because I was mentioning before, Bob McPherson was talking to me one night about when he first heard about Gordon, and they, you know, despite being very different styles of painter, they had commonalities. They both did jackarooing. Bob was a painter and docker. Dad was an abattoir worker. And Bob said to me, "You never blew your cover, like if you're an artist, you know." So. But he said, someone had said to me, you should see this guy down the abattoir. He can do anything. You know, it's like, so, and then he thought, and then they sort of got to know each other, and did a really great portrait of Bob. And, so I think that was, it was probably partly about the cover thing. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. But I was persona non grata for a little while there. I really was. Yeah, and I was beside myself. But anyway, yeah.
Now I want to leave a little bit of time for you guys to ask questions of Nathan and Bruce, but Nathan might be willing to share just a couple of paragraphs from the eulogy he read at Gordon's funeral with us, because it's a beautiful example of Nathan's writing, but also a lovely summation of his experience with Gordon.
I've got a couple of very short poems too that I wrote for him back in 2010. I was trying to distill his own imagery, which was an interesting process, and we sort of had this idea that we might collaborate, but it didn't really work out in that way. But anyway, I'll just read a couple of those beforehand. But the first one is just called Hand, and I like this idea because, you know, he mentions his hand in that video. So he showed me his hand, and under each fingernail, a holding tank with a trap figure. Face. Every day he draws her face in his blood on his chest with his finger and wades into the sea. Shadow. Shadow is very important in Gordon's work. It requires concentration. But as a child, I taught myself how to turn my shadow into a thermometer, to just stare at it for a while and wait for the tidal duet of blood to push up from its ankles. figure. The figure dives into the palm of her own hand, a reconception of sorts. Moments birth reversed, even without touching the rim of her lips, from slit to thread to fingerprint to whirlpool to dot. When we disappear, to disappear again remain where we are, space irrigated with blood. And then jump forward 9 years. We were talking a little bit about this eulogy, so obviously complicated, difficult, and all the rest of it, but there is a section of it where I discuss Gordon's work. Because I'll just make the point, he did rely, I guess, on... He was a very physical painter, so he required a level of energy to be able to paint. So I think in the last few years of his life, unfortunately that just dissipated because he'd had a few strokes and that. So, but I remember once, like we didn't interrupt him when he was painting, but then this lady, who's a great lady, Pam Bell, she rang once, had something important to tell him, and I said, well, he's down the shed. Can you interrupt him? Oh, no, I shouldn't interrupt him. Like I was about 15. She said, no, can you go down and get him? I said, okay. So I went down the shed, and I could just hear this on the wall. There's this bash, bash, bash. Like it was just literally thumping the wall with the brush, I said, Dad, what? Okay. So anyway, but he settled down after that. Anyway, but...
Was it important?
Well, not really, no. Anyway. So I guess because obviously leading from, in spite of his recent frailty, it must be remembered that Gordon, it must be remembered that he created a significant body of work on his own terms. It's still an unresolved mystery to me how he became who he was. The easy labels of talent and technique only account for a small percentage of the whole being. Did he attach himself to the thing, or did the thing attach itself to him? Perhaps in the title of a painting like Man Clutching a Piece of Sky, there's a clue. In the immensity of all things above and below him, there was a frayed thread of horizon that he could keep in his pocket, that he could unravel and stand on without fear of falling, knowing he could fall at any time. For over 5 decades, from the mid-60s onwards, he never let himself off the hook. He would constantly challenge himself to front up. Of his many maxims, the one that best signalled his approach was, it's no use standing a foot off the edge, you've got to stand on it. Sometimes he'd come up from the shed and, in his words, hadn't had a win. He'd say, there's nothing wrong with the paint, plenty wrong with me. He never bought into any comforts within the process. From the early 80s, he started to paint with his hands as if to be absorbed by what he himself absorbed. His own flesh in contact with the surface, powdered minerals and oils mixed and manipulated into images, seduced the distinct anatomies of persons known and unknown, with animals, landscapes, masks, spirits, moons, and all manner of mythomorphic images that communicated with and to Gordon in his own language. As T.S. Eliot said of William Blake, he was naked and saw man naked, and from the centre of his own crystal. For those of us who had the privilege of sitting in the shed, it is an amazing place, what he called his palace of chance. When you're there, you could be anywhere, and frequently were.
Thank you. Such a powerful summation of the enigma, I think, that Gordon was. Thanks so much for sharing that, Nathan. So, your turn. Does anybody have a question of our panel, Nathan or Bruce, who also had decades of experience working with Gordon?
Well, you too, probably. I remember reading a review, and the Australian was probably 20 years ago. Wasn't it? Yeah.
I did a couple of interviews, but he was so memorable. You never forgot the feeling of being with him in that shed. Beth, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. I think you might have answered it, though, Nathan, in your what you've just read, because when I looked at Gordon's work, before I even knew that he actually worked in an abattoir or, what his life story was, I saw the works as being very mythological and working on this sort of allegorical and very sort of charged symbolic level. So the bull was always kind of like a minotaur, or the female was the counterpoint to the masculine bull, and this, and the winged figures were Icarus, and I just saw all of that kind of energy and storytelling going on, and in very sort of abstracted and kind of resonant ways. So I just wanted to know, if that was true. I mean, and did he share that kind of thinking?
I think so. I think that's pretty astute reading. I guess the way it started and the way things end, like, I guess he didn't know. So I think once he was in the process, he just let it do the talking, and I think it really became, one thing could become something else. So, so whether it was an accidental idea of merging the female figure with the bullock, I'm not sure, but it certainly became a powerful image in his work, and something that would, I think, almost unconsciously crop up sometimes. They're almost like signposts in his process, because, and even, just at home, you would get a lot of, like, even this little work here, like you could look at it, and you could be, in the days when we sat in a chair to talk on the phone, you would, you just look at this thing that had been on a wall for years, and you just notice something you hadn't noticed before, or so. Obviously, some of it he put there, and obviously some of it it was really, like the couple of times I did see him paint, he was really, it was like a wrestling match in a way. You could tell that he was ahead of what he was doing sometimes, and sometimes it was ahead of him, and he'd sort of have this weird conversation with himself, frequently swearing at himself to catch up or whatever. So, so I guess it partly there's a structure, but partly it was improvising, and all those, I guess it was really a private mythology in a way, but whether he'd actually tell you what it was about is another question, and whether your meaning might have been different from mine, and if we look at the same picture, it's always a possibility too. So, yeah.
Nathan, when Gordon painted flowers, do you think that was a mellowing of his own personality at that stage of his life?
Possibility, yeah.
Because, let's face it, the sea of dark eyes is a hell of a long way from a bunch of flowers.
Yeah. Well, even some of the bullocks, like he did a couple of interesting bullocks in the 60s where they were really bright, like there were a couple where they were just bright, and he said that was because of, it's just part of the process at the abattoir. They had fantastic flower beds because of all the great blood and bone fertiliser. But he'd just do these brush, he'd just get the brush, like this big 4-inch brush, and he'd just sort of twist it around in a circle, to make poppies or something like that. So, but I guess he became, but generally until about the early 80s really, he was working on a fairly large scale all the time, so there could be a pragmatic reason there too. And probably partly my fault really. I said to him about 1983, why don't you, Mum was still alive for her birthday, And so he did, and on a small scale like that, and then he started, he started doing a lot more still lives, I think when the scale got smaller. But then after Mum died, he would use the flowers, like he'd start painting still lives about her, or, just in a simple way, 6 years since her death, he'd do 6 flowers or something like that. So even within the idea of a still life, there's something behind it as well. But yeah, I guess, he did sort of mellow a bit as he got older, I think.
Guess we could have one more at the risk of running over time. Was there another question?
I have a quick one. I was just wondering, after working in the abattoir and the paintings that were created out of those experiences, how did he feel about eating red meat?
Fine. I've got to say, he was a fantastic cook. He was a great cook.
And always improvised, didn't he?
Yeah, like it was quite surreal, like almost like being in a sort of Holland Park West version of a Fellini film sometimes, because You know, he just walked through the door at 10 o'clock with a lamb on his shoulder. You know, and then you'd hear on the sink, it'd be whack, whack, whack. And he'd be chopping it up. You know, and he had this giant pan, which just produced the most amazing meals, and you know, to the point where it's not lamb again, you know. But it was fantastic, and he cooked it on these 2 jets. It was above the stove, but yeah, I remember him. He's a real bit of an improviser. I remember even wrapping a whole roast in like bread dough once or something, you know, just to see how it worked. You know, it was great.
Lamb pie.
Yeah. So he was. Yeah, no, I can't say he had, but I've got to say, although he had great respect for, you know, who realised that you were eating something you'd killed, basically. So, same with the fishing. Like he would bring the fish home, he'd fillet the fish, and next time he'd go to the bay, he'd always take the frames with him and return them with the water or feed them to the eagles or something like that. So, he understood the cycle of that sort of thing. So, yeah.
So I think it falls to me to say thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, Nathan and Bruce. It's been amazing to share the stage with you tonight.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
lovely to acknowledge Gordon's work in this way. Its power just continues to grow, I think. And also I need to tell you that this is our last Portrait of the Artist for 2019, or the State Library's last Portrait of the Artist for 2019. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2020.
Thank you.